The silence that started the legend. The room was too quiet for a man the world called the king. Outside, reporters shouted his name like it was a battle cry. Flashbulbs exploded against the gates of Graceland, turning night into fractured daylight. Inside, Elvis Presley sat perfectly still, a half-empty glass sweating in his hand, the television murmuring accusations he refused to answer. The headline crawling across the screen didn't ask for his music. It asked for an explanation. And Elvis did what he had done more and more in the final years of his life. He said nothing. The world believed silence meant guilt. The press believed silence meant weakness. But the truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. Because when a man becomes a myth, every word he speaks can shatter something larger than himself. He had learned that the hard way. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he laughed easily, when interviews felt like performances and performances felt like freedom. In the early days, when the cameras first chased him across the South, he answered questions with a crooked grin and a flash of humility that made teenage girls faint and fathers nervous. They asked him about the hips, about the voice, about the scandal. He shrugged, he joked, he sang louder. But fame is not a spotlight, it's a furnace. And over time, the heat changes you. By the time the gates of Graceland became a permanent barricade, Elvis understood something the world did not. The more he explained himself, the less they listened. They didn't want the human being from Tupelo, they wanted the symbol. They wanted the lightning bolt in a rhinestone suit. They wanted the version of him that could carry their fantasies without cracking under the weight. So he stopped explaining. The first time he chose silence deliberately, it felt like control. A reporter had asked about the rumors. Pills, exhaustion, isolation. The question was sharp, almost eager. The room leaned forward, waiting for confession or denial. Elvis leaned back instead. He looked at the man for a long second, long enough for discomfort to bloom, and then he smiled faintly and moved on to the next question. The crowd laughed nervously. The reporter tried again. No answer. That night, the newspapers ran with their own conclusions, and Elvis read every word. Not because he believed them, but because he understood the game. The more outrageous the story, the more powerful the legend. If he denied it, he fueled it. If he confirmed it, he destroyed it. Silence, he realized, kept the myth intact. But silence has a cost. Behind the walls of Graceland, the quiet was heavier than the noise outside. The hallways stretched long and dim under chandelier light. Footsteps echoed like distant thunder. Friends came and went, some loyal, some temporary, some drawn by gravity to the orbit of fame. Yet even in a room full of laughter, there were moments when Elvis drifted inward, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. He wasn't ignoring the world. He was calculating it. Every word from his mouth could become a weapon, or a wound, and he had people to protect. A family, a name, a fragile empire built on image. The king could not afford to look uncertain. He could not afford to look small, and explanations, by their very nature, make a man small. They admit doubt. They reveal cracks. The public didn't want cracks. They wanted marble, so Elvis became marble. Still, polished, untouchable. Yet marble feels nothing, and Elvis felt everything. The expectations were relentless. Concert tours that bled into each other, hotel rooms that all smelled the same, applause that roared like an ocean but faded the moment the curtain fell. In those fading seconds, when the lights dimmed and the band stopped playing, there was always a question hanging in the dark. Who are you when they stop cheering? It was a question he never answered publicly. Instead, he turned the volume up. More shows, more spectacle, more distance between the man and the myth. The cameras loved the jumpsuits, the capes, the dramatic bows. They didn't film the exhaustion in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. They didn't record the pauses between breaths. And when whispers began about health, about habits, about decline, the world demanded clarity.
"Explain yourself," they said. "Tell us the truth." But the truth was not a headline. The truth was messy and human and unfinished. And Elvis understood something instinctively. Once you explain yourself, you surrender the mystery. And mystery was the final layer of armor he had left. There were nights when he almost broke. Nights when the pressure pressed so hard against his ribs it felt difficult to breathe. He would walk alone through the rooms of Graceland, past gold records and framed memories, past the evidence of triumph, and feel the strange isolation of a man surrounded by proof of his own legend. He could have called a press conference. He could have told them everything about the fatigue, the fear of disappointing millions, the loneliness that no crowd could cure. But confession would not have set him free. It would have turned vulnerability into spectacle, and he refused to let his humanity become another performance. So he chose silence again. Outside the gates, fans held signs. They cried. They prayed. They believed in him with a devotion that bordered on sacred. To them, Elvis was not complicated. He was salvation in a white suit. How could he explain to them that sometimes salvation feels trapped? How could he admit that the king sometimes wished to step down from the throne just for a moment and breathe as a man? No, better to say nothing. Better to let the myth carry the weight. And so the silence grew. It wrapped around him like velvet, soft, suffocating, protective. Interviews became shorter. Statements became rarer. Smiles became practiced. The world filled the gaps with its own stories, its own theories, its own convenient narratives. Some painted him as invincible. Others painted him as unraveling. Both were wrong. The truth lived somewhere in between, unspoken. What no one understood then was that his silence was not indifference. It was strategy. It was protection. It was, in a strange way, love. Because every explanation risks hurting someone.
Every admission shifts blame, redirects scrutiny, exposes private fractures. Elvis had learned that fame feeds on confession, and he refused to feed it. But silence, like all defenses, creates distance. And in the shadows of Graceland, there was someone quietly watching. Small footsteps in long hallways, curious eyes absorbing more than adults realized. A daughter growing up inside the echo of a legend. She would one day understand what the world never did, that his silence was not emptiness, it was burden, and she would carry that understanding long after the flashbulbs faded. On that quiet night, as reporters eventually dispersed and the gates settled back into stillness, Elvis remained seated, unmoving, the television now dark. He stared at his reflection in the glass. No jumpsuit, no stage lights, no roaring crowd. Just a man. For a brief second, he opened his mouth as if to speak, as if the explanation the world demanded was finally ready to be born. But no words came. Instead, he exhaled slowly, set the glass down, and let the silence answer for him. And in that silence, the legend grew louder than ever. The myth the world created. By the time the gates of Graceland became a landmark instead of a home, the transformation was complete. Elvis Presley was no longer simply a man who sang songs. He was an industry, an icon, a silhouette cut from lightning and stitched into American memory. The world had built a version of him so powerful that even he struggled to recognize it. And the more the myth expanded, the less space there was for the human being inside it. It didn't happen overnight. Myths never do. They grow slowly, fed by applause and headlines, by television specials and sold-out arenas. Every performance added a new layer. Every camera angle sharpened the legend. When he stepped onto a stage in a white jumpsuit, the crowd didn't see fatigue or doubt. They saw destiny. They saw the king. And kings, by definition, do not explain themselves. They decree.
They perform. They remain untouchable. That expectation became a prison disguised as a crown. The press helped build the walls. Magazines printed glossy covers that captured him mid-pose, frozen in perfection. Stories framed him as either superhuman or spiraling, never ordinary, never conflicted, never quietly overwhelmed. There was no market for nuance. America wanted spectacle. It wanted a hero large enough to fill its post-war dreams, loud enough to drown out its anxieties. Elvis became that hero. But heroes don't get to age in public. They don't get to hesitate. And they certainly don't get to fall apart where anyone can see. As concert tours intensified, so did the narrative. Sold-out shows in city after city turned into proof of invincibility. The louder the screams, the stronger the illusion. Backstage, however, the myth required maintenance. Appearances had to be managed. Energy had to be summoned on command. Smiles had to look effortless. If he seemed distant, it was called mystery. If he seemed tired, it was called decadence. The truth, that he was simply human, never made the headlines, and the machine surrounding him ensured it stayed that way. Managers, promoters, executives, they all understood the same unspoken rule: protect the image at all costs. The brand of Elvis Presley was bigger than any confession he might offer. A single vulnerable interview could dent years of careful construction. A single admission of fear could ripple through ticket sales, merchandise, loyalty. So the machine encouraged silence. Not cruelly, not even consciously at times. It was just business. And business thrives on certainty, not complexity. There were moments when Elvis felt the gap widening between who he was and who the world believed him to be. He would catch glimpses of himself on television, slow-motion replays of dramatic bows, sweat glistening under stage lights, and feel like he was watching a character he once auditioned for and never stopped playing.
The audience roared at the image, but the man behind it sometimes felt like a ghost.
The myth demanded stamina. It demanded charisma, even on the worst days. It demanded that he remain the symbol of rebellion, romance, and raw American power long after the cultural tides began to shift. New artists emerged. New sounds dominated the charts. Yet the legend of Elvis had to remain timeless, frozen at its peak. That kind of expectation doesn't bend. It presses down. And when rumors began to circulate about health, about prescriptions, about isolation, the myth reacted like a threatened kingdom. Defenders dismissed criticism as jealousy. Critics sharpened their pens. The public split into believers and doubters. But no one asked the simplest question: what does it cost to live inside a legend? Inside Graceland, the evidence of success was everywhere. Gold records, awards, rooms designed like statements of triumph. Visitors saw opulence. They saw proof that the American dream had chosen its favorite son. What they didn't see were the quiet negotiations happening behind closed doors. Conversations about image, about appearances, about what should be said and what must never be admitted. Each decision tightened the narrative. Each omission strengthened the myth. Silence became part of the architecture, and architecture, once built, is hard to tear down without bringing the whole structure with it. Elvis understood this instinctively. He knew that explaining himself would humanize him, and humanizing him would shrink him in the eyes of millions who needed him larger than life. The myth wasn't just for profit, it was for belief. Fans didn't just buy tickets, they invested faith. They projected dreams onto him. To confess weakness would feel to some like betrayal, so he carried their projections like armor, even when the armor cut into his skin. Yet myths are fragile things. The stronger they appear, the more carefully they must be guarded. Every public appearance became a test. Did he look strong enough, confident enough, legendary enough? Cameras searched for cracks. Critics searched for decline. And Elvis, aware of every lens, gave them as little as possible. A nod, a smile, a performance powerful enough to silence doubt, for a night. But doubt always returned. It lived in the spaces between shows, in the early morning hours when the house was quiet, and the applause existed only as memory. It whispered questions no interviewer dared to ask directly. Are you tired? Are you lonely? Do you regret becoming this symbol? The myth had no room for those questions, so they remained unanswered, echoing against the walls. Outside, the narrative grew more extreme. Some painted him as a fallen idol, others as a misunderstood genius. Both versions were easier to consume than the complicated reality of a man navigating fame, expectation, and personal struggle simultaneously. Extremes sell, balance does not. And so the myth expanded in both directions, larger, louder, less accurate. What made it even more suffocating was that parts of the myth were true. He was extraordinary. He was magnetic. He did change music forever. But greatness does not cancel humanity. It intensifies it. And the greater the pedestal, the further the fall appears. That perception alone was enough to keep him guarded, because once you are placed on a throne, every stumble feels catastrophic. There were advisors who suggested carefully crafted interviews, controlled narratives, strategic transparency.
Let the public see just enough vulnerability to appear authentic, they said. But authenticity on a schedule is still performance, and Elvis sensed the trap. If he began explaining selectively, where would it end? How much of himself would remain private? How much would become content? So he retreated further into the only space he could fully control: silence. The world interpreted that silence however it wished. Some called it arrogance, others called it mystery. Few recognized it as self-preservation. The myth required distance.
And distance required quiet. In the end, the public didn't just create the legend, they demanded its continuity. Every ticket purchased, every scream from the crowd, every headline proclaiming him the king reinforced the structure. It was a collective creation, and once created, it could not easily be undone. But myths have shadows, and in those shadows, truths wait. The world saw the crown. It didn't see the weight pressing down beneath it. It saw the spectacle. It didn't see the calculation behind every withheld word. And as the myth grew stronger, something else grew quietly alongside it, an unspoken understanding forming in the eyes of someone much closer to him, someone who didn't see a symbol or a headline, someone who saw the man walking through dim hallways after midnight, shoulders heavier than they appeared under stage lights. The myth belonged to the world, but the truth belonged to the family. And soon, that truth would begin to surface, not in confessions from the king, but in the life of the daughter who watched him carry the crown in silence. The weight he refused to share. There is a moment after every concert when the noise dies so suddenly it feels unnatural. The lights fade, the band steps back, and the roar that once shook the arena collapses into a hollow echo. For Elvis Presley, that moment was never peaceful. It was heavy, because when the applause stopped, the myth loosened its grip just enough for reality to slip through. Backstage mirrors reflected more than sweat and stage makeup. They reflected exhaustion. Not the kind cured by sleep, but the kind that settles into the bones when expectation never rests. The world believed the crown was a privilege. Few understood it was also pressure, constant, unrelenting, invisible. He had built an empire on charisma and confidence, yet the higher he climbed, the less space he had to admit uncertainty. The king could not confess doubt. The king could not say, "I'm overwhelmed." So he didn't. Instead, he carried it. The weight wasn't only fame, it was responsibility, family, friends, employees whose livelihoods depended on the continuation of a legend. Every show sold out wasn't just applause, it was payroll. Every canceled appearance wasn't just disappointment, it was financial shockwaves. That knowledge settled on his shoulders like armor made of iron, heavy, necessary, unforgiving. There were nights when his body signaled limits long before his pride did. Long tours blurred cities into sameness, hotel rooms with identical curtains, identical carpets, identical silence. He would sit alone after midnight, television flickering without sound, prescriptions lined neatly beside the bed like quiet promises of relief. Relief from pain, relief from insomnia, relief from thoughts that refused to dim. The public saw energy. They saw dramatic stage entrances and powerful finales. They didn't see the preparation required just to stand upright under the lights. They didn't see the negotiations with his own body. And he would never tell them, because explaining that kind of struggle risks changing how people look at you. It shifts admiration into concern, concern into doubt, doubt into headlines. He had watched it happen to others. The moment vulnerability becomes public, it transforms into narrative, and narratives are rarely kind. So he absorbed it privately. When rumors began to circulate about his health, about the medication, about his changing appearance, interviewers sharpened their questions. There was opportunity in his supposed decline. A dramatic fall sells almost as well as a meteoric rise. He knew that. He sensed it in the tone of their voices. And each time the door opened for explanation, he chose restraint instead. Silence became discipline. But discipline has consequences. The more he refused to share, the more isolated he became. Friends would ask gently if he was all right. He would smile and redirect the conversation. Advisors would suggest strategic honesty. He would nod and change the subject.
Even within the gates of Graceland, where laughter echoed through decorated rooms, there were invisible walls. He protected others from the depth of his fatigue. He protected the image from cracks. And in doing so, he protected no one from the distance growing between them. There were flashes of frustration, rare, sharp, quickly suppressed. Moments when the pressure surfaced in a raised voice or a slammed door. Not cruelty, not chaos, just the sound of a man stretched thin. But even those moments were swallowed by routine. Apologies offered, smiles restored, performances scheduled. The machine did not pause for introspection, and neither did the myth. Yet beneath the control was fear. Not fear of failure. He had already achieved more than most could imagine. It was fear of disappointing belief. Millions of people had invested pieces of their identity into him. They played his records during heartbreak. They blasted his songs during celebration. His voice had become the soundtrack to their lives. How could he reveal that sometimes he felt uncertain about his own? How could he admit that strength on stage did not always translate to strength in solitude? So he swallowed the confession, again and again. The weight he refused to share wasn't just personal struggle. It was contradiction. He was both adored and scrutinized, both powerful and dependent, both larger than life and painfully human. Living inside those opposites required balance that few could see, and balancing in public, without ever acknowledging the strain, demands silence. There were nights when he walked alone through the long corridors of Graceland, past framed awards that shimmered under chandelier light. Each gold record represented triumph, each plaque represented validation, yet none of them answered the private questions echoing in his mind. Was he still evolving? Or was he preserving a past version of himself because the world refused to let it fade? Growth requires change, but change threatens legacy, and legacy was everything. The irony was cruel. The more he tried to protect the myth by withholding explanation, the more speculation filled the vacuum. Newspapers guessed, commentators assumed, fans argued, and still he said nothing. Because correcting every rumor would mean dedicating his life to defense instead of creation, and he refused to become reactive. Better to remain enigmatic. Better to let mystery do the talking. But mystery is not warmth. It does not comfort those closest to you. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the night stretched long, there were eyes that noticed the fatigue he hid from the world. Small eyes, observant eyes. A daughter learning early that fame does not erase vulnerability, it disguises it. She watched him move through rooms with the confidence of a legend and the heaviness of a man carrying more than he would admit. She sensed the pauses in his voice, the way conversations sometimes stopped mid-thought, the way laughter occasionally felt like effort. He never sat her down and explained the pressure. He never described the cost of sustaining a myth. He likely believed he was shielding her from it. But children see what adults try hardest to hide. And in those silent observations, a quiet understanding began forming. Outside, the world continued to demand answers. Why the weight gain? Why the cancellations? Why the retreat from interviews? The questions piled up like storm clouds, and still Elvis held his ground, not because he had no answers, but because some answers, once spoken, cannot be reclaimed. They become permanent, printed, replayed, analyzed. He valued privacy more than vindication, and that choice, though powerful, deepened the isolation. The weight he refused to share did not break him in a single dramatic moment. It accumulated slowly, layer by layer. Expectation.
Responsibility. Image. Protection. Love. Yes, love. Because beneath the silence was devotion, to family, to fans, to the legacy he had built from nothing. He believed that by staying quiet, he was preserving something sacred. But preservation can look like distance, and distance can feel like absence. One evening, after a performance that left the crowd electrified, he lingered backstage longer than usual. The mirror reflected a man both triumphant and tired. He placed his hands on the dressing table and stared at himself, not at the icon, but at the individual beneath it. For a fleeting second, his expression softened,
as if he might finally release the truth he carried. He opened his mouth slightly. The words were there, honest, vulnerable, dangerous. Then footsteps approached, a knock at the door. 5 more minutes, someone called. The world was waiting again. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his collar, let the moment pass. When he stepped back into the hallway, the mask was seamless. The wait remained unspoken, and somewhere nearby, watching quietly, his daughter absorbed another lesson, that greatness often comes wrapped in silence, and that silence can hide more love and more pain than the loudest confession ever could. Daughter watching from the shadows. In the long, echoing hallways of Graceland, legends didn't walk, they loomed. Gold records shimmered beneath chandelier light, framed photographs froze applause into permanent triumph, and every room carried the scent of history still being written. But for Lisa Marie Presley, it was never a museum. It was home. And home has a way of revealing truths that the world refuses to see. To the public, Elvis Presley was thunder. On stage, he moved like electricity given form. Crowds reached toward him as if he were something sacred. But to Lisa, he was also the man who padded down quiet corridors late at night, who paused outside her room just to listen for the sound of steady breathing, who sometimes looked tired in a way that applause could not fix. She was young, but not unaware. Children raised in extraordinary circumstances develop an unusual sensitivity. They learn to read what isn't said, and what wasn't said in Graceland was often louder than anything spoken. There were mornings when sunlight spilled across the mansion's floors, and everything felt almost ordinary. Breakfast laughter, soft music playing somewhere in the background. Her father's voice, gentle, playful, present. In those moments, the myth dissolved completely. There was no king, no icon, just a father with warm hands and careful eyes. But the transformation was always waiting. A phone call, a rehearsal, a flight to catch. The house would shift subtly, like air pressure changing before a storm. Staff moved faster, schedules tightened, and Elvis would step into the version of himself the world demanded. Lisa watched this shift more times than anyone realized. She noticed the way his posture changed before leaving for a show, the way his expression settled into something composed, almost sculpted. It wasn't fake, it was protective. Even as a child, she sensed that. He wasn't becoming someone else, he was becoming untouchable, and untouchable people are harder to hurt. At night, when the gates outside pulsed with camera flashes and distant shouts, she sometimes stood near the windows, peering through curtains at the chaos. To her, it felt surreal. How could so many strangers need the same man who tucked her into bed? How could the world claim ownership over someone who belonged, in her mind, simply as dad? That tension formed early, the difference between public and private, between myth and memory. She learned that the world's version of her father was incomplete. They saw strength, spectacle, dominance. She saw hesitation in quiet moments. She saw the brief flicker of fatigue he thought no one noticed. She saw the silence he carried like armor. And she began to understand that silence wasn't emptiness, it was restraint. There were evenings when he returned from performances, still humming with adrenaline. He would sit with her, sometimes unusually still, as if grounding himself. She didn't always understand the weight he bore, but she felt its presence. Children are experts at sensing atmosphere, and the atmosphere around Elvis often carried something heavy, even when the rooms were full of light. The world speculated endlessly about him. Headlines painted extremes, invincible superstar or unraveling idol. But those narratives never entered her world the way they entered his. For her, the contradiction wasn't a story, it was daily life. She saw how carefully he avoided certain questions at dinner, how quickly he redirected conversations when topics grew too sharp. She saw protection in that avoidance, not weakness. He was guarding something, perhaps her, perhaps himself, perhaps both. As you grew older, the awareness sharpened. Fame was not abstract anymore, it was tangible. It shaped where she could go, who she could trust, how she was perceived before she ever spoke. She wasn't just Lisa, she was Elvis's daughter. That title arrived before introductions. It followed her into rooms. It hovered in conversations. And slowly she realized that the myth that confined him was beginning to cast its shadow over her too. Yet she never saw him complain about it publicly. That silence became a lesson. Strength meant enduring. Dignity meant withholding. If he felt misrepresented, he didn't correct the record loudly. If he felt wounded by criticism, he didn't retaliate in interviews. He absorbed it. Watching that taught her something profound and complicated, that sometimes love looks like silence, that sometimes protection requires misunderstanding. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when she sensed he wanted to say more. A half-finished sentence, a distant gaze lingering too long, a sigh that seemed to carry unsaid words. But the confession never came. He would shift the subject, smile, ask about her day instead. And in that redirection was a quiet choice: shield her from the full weight of his reality. The irony was that shielding also created mystery. She grew up aware that parts of her father's world were off-limits, not because they were sinister, but because they were fragile. Fame had edges, sharp ones, and he navigated them carefully, refusing to let her see where he sometimes stumbled. But children sense stumbles even when they don't witness them directly. She heard the tone in adult conversations when they thought she wasn't listening. She noticed the tension in rooms after difficult phone calls. She felt the emotional temperature shift when rumors intensified outside the gates. And she began forming her own quiet understanding that being a legend did not make someone immune to pressure. It amplified it. The contrast between the stage and the silence fascinated her. She had seen him command thousands with a single note. She had seen audiences hang on every movement. Yet she had also seen him sit alone, contemplative, almost fragile in stillness. That duality never confused her. It clarified something. The myth was loud, the man was layered, and the layers were rarely offered to the public. Over time, she would realize that his refusal to explain himself wasn't indifference. It was deliberate. He knew that once vulnerability becomes public property, it stops belonging to you. It gets dissected, reinterpreted, monetized. He would not allow his humanity to be turned into spectacle, so he kept it close to family, close to silence. And Lisa, standing in those shadowed hallways, absorbed that philosophy without ever attending a formal lesson. The world saw distance in him. She saw discipline. The world saw mystery. She saw protection. The world demanded clarity. She saw cost. That difference would shape her understanding for the rest of her life. Because one day, the cameras would turn toward her. One day, the myth would not just be something she observed. It would be something she carried. And when that moment came, the lessons learned in the quiet corners of Graceland would return with startling clarity. Silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes it is the only thing standing between love and exposure. As the nights grew heavier and the headlines grew louder, she watched her father navigate both with a composure that bordered on sacrificial. He never invited the world into his private battles. He never offered explanations that would satisfy curiosity at the expense of dignity. And though she may not have fully understood it then, she felt its meaning. The king ruled the stage, but in the shadows, a daughter was learning the truth behind the crown. And that truth was far more human than the legend the world insisted on believing. Living inside a myth. After the gates of Graceland closed for the last time on Elvis Presley, the world didn't grow quiet. It grew louder. Candlelight vigils turned into permanent pilgrimage. His music climbed charts again. Documentaries replayed his image until it felt immortal. The myth did not fade with the man. It solidified. And standing in the center of that echo was Lisa Marie Presley. She was no longer just a daughter watching from the shadows. She had become the living bridge between legend and reality. Grief is heavy on its own, but grief inside a global spotlight is suffocating. She wasn't allowed to mourn quietly. Cameras tracked her expressions. Headlines interpreted her silence. Every public appearance was dissected for clues. Was she strong? Was she breaking? Was she worthy of the name? The name. Presley. It arrived before her voice did. It shaped expectations before she ever sang a note. People didn't just look at her. They measured her. Against him. Against memory. Against perfection. Living inside a myth is different from observing one.
When she was young, the legend belonged to the world, and the father belonged to her. Now the boundary blurred. The world believed they had ownership over his story, and by extension, over hers. Interviews often carried an unspoken demand. Explain him, clarify him, reveal what he never said, as if she held a key to a vault of secrets the public was entitled to open. But what the world called curiosity sometimes felt like intrusion. She understood something many did not. The silence her father maintained was not emptiness, it was protection. And protection does not dissolve simply because someone passes away. There were moments when she considered speaking more openly, addressing rumors directly, correcting distortions, offering the nuanced, complicated truth of who he was behind closed doors. But each time she faced the same question he once did. At what cost? Because once you reduce a complex human life to a public explanation, you cannot control how it is reshaped. Sound bites replace context, headlines replace emotion, and private pain becomes public property. So she walked a careful line. In interviews, she shared memories, warm, intimate, grounding. She spoke of laughter in hallways, of music drifting through rooms late at night. She defended his character when narratives turned cruel, but she never dismantled the myth completely. She never dragged the private into full exposure. Some critics interpreted that as evasiveness. Others called it loyalty. The truth lived somewhere deeper. She wasn't protecting an image. She was protecting a relationship. The world wanted a definitive answer to who Elvis really was, but no single explanation could contain him. He was brilliance and vulnerability, discipline and excess, generosity and isolation.
To choose one side publicly would betray the balance she had witnessed privately, and so, like him, she understood the power of restraint. Yet living inside that restraint came with consequences. Every creative step she took was compared. When she pursued her own music, it wasn't heard in isolation. It was measured against a legacy that reshaped American culture. If her voice carried emotion, it was called inheritance. If it carried difference, it was called deviation. There was no neutral ground. She was either fulfilling destiny or failing expectation. Rarely was she simply allowed to exist. The myth cast long shadows, and shadows distort proportion. Even her personal life was filtered through the lens of her father's fame. Relationships became headlines. Decisions became narratives. The public seemed perpetually surprised that she was complex, strong-willed, flawed, evolving. But complexity should never have been surprising. It was, after all, what she had grown up understanding about her father. She had seen firsthand how damaging simplification could be. That awareness shaped her choices. When asked directly about his struggles, she responded with measured honesty. Yes, he was human. Yes, he faced pressures unimaginable to most. But she resisted turning his pain into spectacle. There was dignity in not oversharing. There was power in refusing to let tragedy become entertainment. In that sense, she carried forward more than a last name. She carried a philosophy. There were nights when the weight felt almost inherited. Standing on stages of her own, lights blinding, applause rising, she likely felt echoes of what he must have felt. The duality, the surge of connection, the quiet afterward. The difference was that she had grown up watching the cost. She understood that applause is fleeting, but narrative is permanent, and narratives are rarely gentle. Living inside a myth means constantly negotiating identity. Who are you when your surname carries history?
Who are you when strangers feel entitled to your memories? She could have rebelled loudly, exposed everything, shattered illusions, forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. That would have been one form of control. But she chose something more subtle. She chose selective revelation. Enough truth to humanize, enough mystery to preserve. That balance was not weakness. It was intentional, because she knew what the world sometimes forgets. Myths survive not because they are entirely false, but because they are partially true. Her father had been extraordinary. He had also been imperfect. To reduce him to either would be dishonest, and dishonesty, even in the name of transparency, was something she refused to offer. The tension followed her into every chapter of her life. Public scrutiny, personal loss,
creative ambition. Through it all, the comparison remained constant. Yet she did not run from the name. She carried it, sometimes visibly heavy, sometimes quietly proud. There is strength in inheritance when it is chosen, not resented. And though the weight was undeniable, so was the love beneath it. Because beyond the myth, beyond the spectacle, beyond the endless analysis, she remembered the simplest truth. He was her father, not a headline, not a theory, not a cultural artifact. A man who walked softly through hallways late at night. A man who guarded his words carefully. A man who believed that some truths were too sacred for public consumption. And so she lived with that understanding. She did not dismantle the myth. She lived alongside it. She corrected when necessary, defended when required, remained silent when dignity demanded it. The world continued to ask for clarity, for definitive explanations that would finally decode the legend. But perhaps the legend was never meant to be decoded. Perhaps it was meant to be felt. And in living her life, not as a spokesperson for a myth, but as a daughter shaped by one, Lisa Marie proved something quietly powerful. The truth behind Elvis was not a scandal waiting to be revealed. It was a human story, too layered for a single explanation. And sometimes, the most honest way to honor that truth is not to shout it, but to carry it. The truth he never said out loud. There are some truths that don't arrive in statements. They don't live inside press conferences or carefully edited interviews. They exist in glances, in pauses, in the way a person exhales when they think no one is watching. For Elvis Presley, the truth the world demanded was never going to be delivered in a headline. It was too layered, too human, and perhaps too fragile to survive public consumption. By the time the myth had reached its peak, explanations had become currency. Every network wanted exclusives. Every magazine promised the real story. But the real story was not a single revelation. It was contradiction. He loved the stage and feared disappointing it. He cherished privacy, yet lived under relentless observation. He wanted connection, yet guarded himself with silence. To explain one side without the other would distort the whole, and distortion was something he had already endured enough of. There were decisions he made that confused even loyal fans, professional choices that seemed abrupt, periods of withdrawal that sparked speculation, relationships the press tried to reduce to drama. The world searched for a neat narrative. Genius rises, genius falls. But life rarely obeys narrative structure. Life is uneven, emotional, complicated. He knew that if he began unpacking every decision publicly, he would spend the rest of his life defending context instead of living it. So he chose restraint. Not because he lacked answers, but because he understood the appetite of the audience. Once you offer explanation, the hunger grows. Clarify this, now that. What about this rumor? What about that mistake? It never ends. And at some point, explanation becomes performance. He had performed enough.
What remained unspoken wasn't just struggle, it was intention. He understood the power of mystique. In an era before constant digital exposure, mystery still held value. Silence could elevate, it could protect, it could keep a part of the soul untouched by commerce. He guarded that part fiercely. But silence is often misunderstood as avoidance. Critics framed it as arrogance. Some interpreted it as guilt. Few recognized it as control. He refused to let the most vulnerable parts of his existence be edited by strangers. He refused to let his humanity be flattened into a digestible storyline. And in that refusal was quiet strength. After his passing, the hunger for explanation intensified. Documentaries multiplied. Books claimed insight. Theories expanded. The absence of his voice created space for others to speak on his behalf. And that was the final irony. His silence, once protective, became an open field for interpretation. This was the world Lisa Marie Presley inherited, a world that believed answers were overdue. She was asked questions he had declined, pressed for clarity he had withheld, as if proximity granted obligation. But proximity does not erase principle. She knew what he had protected, and she understood why. In interviews, when questions drifted toward the more painful chapters,
Health, pressure, isolation. She answered carefully, not defensively, not evasively, carefully. She acknowledged his humanity without dismantling his dignity. She admitted complexity without sensationalizing it. That balance was not accidental. It was learned, because she had lived inside the tension between myth and man. She knew the truth was not a single confession waiting to be unleashed. It was a mosaic of moments, some beautiful, some heavy, all deeply personal. There were stories she could have told that would have stunned audiences, intimate details that would have trended instantly. But virality is not the same as honesty, and exposure is not the same as understanding.
She chose depth over drama, respect over revelation. In doing so, she frustrated those who craved a definitive unraveling of the legend. But perhaps the legend was never meant to unravel. Perhaps it was meant to remain partially obscured, because within that obscurity lived privacy, and within privacy lived love. The truth he never said out loud was not a dark secret waiting for daylight. It was simpler and heavier. He was human. He felt pressure. He felt expectation. He made imperfect choices. He experienced loneliness despite adoration. None of that negated his greatness. It contextualized it. But context is rarely as marketable as mystery, and so mystery endured. Lisa understood that reducing him to either victim or villain would be dishonest. He was neither. He was a man navigating unprecedented fame in a world unequipped to handle it gently. The cost of that navigation was internal, not theatrical, and internal costs are the hardest to explain without being misunderstood. In quiet reflections, she likely recognized something profound. His silence had been an act of authorship. By refusing to narrate every chapter publicly, he retained ownership of his story. Even in absence, that ownership lingered. The world could speculate, but it could never claim full access. That boundary was intentional, and she honored it. Yet honoring it did not mean ignoring reality. She spoke of his warmth, his humor, his deep love for family. She acknowledged his struggles without reducing him to them. In doing so, she offered something more powerful than confession. She offered perspective. Perspective does not shout, it steadies, and steady truths often outlast dramatic revelations. The public sometimes confuses silence with secrecy, but secrecy hides shame. Silence can protect dignity. There is a difference. He was not hiding from the world. He was shielding parts of himself from distortion.
And she, having witnessed the fragility of those parts, refused to let them be mishandled after he was gone. The truth he never said out loud lives not in a single quote, but in the pattern of his choices, in the interviews he declined, in the questions he redirected, in the composure he maintained under scrutiny. It lives in the restraint she practiced decades later when given the microphone. It lives in the understanding that not every truth must be broadcast to be real. As the years passed and the legend continued to evolve through cultural memory, one thing became clear. The myth survived not because the truth was absent, but because the truth was protected. Protected from oversimplification, from exploitation, from being torn apart for consumption. And perhaps that protection was the final act of control in a life often dictated by demand. In the end, the world never received a full explanation from Elvis. It received music, presence, impact, and silence. But in that silence was intention, and in the life of his daughter, that intention found quiet continuation. The king never explained himself, not fully, not publicly, and maybe that was the point. Because some lives are not meant to be summarized. Some stories resist neat conclusions, and some truths are too human to survive the spotlight without losing their shape. Silence as the final crown. Legends don't usually end, they echo. Decades after Elvis Presley left the stage for the last time, his voice still drifts through speakers, through documentaries, through late-night radio waves that refuse to let him fade. Tourists still gather outside Graceland, pressing their hands against iron gates as if proximity might answer the questions history never did. They come searching for clarity, for closure, for the missing explanation. But the gates do not speak, and neither did he. That silence, once criticized, now feels intentional, almost architectural. It is the final structure he left standing.
For years, critics insisted that if he had simply explained himself, addressed the rumors directly, confronted the speculation, detailed every private battle, the narrative would have softened. Maybe. Or maybe it would have shattered into 1,000 competing interpretations. Because explanation invites dissection, and dissection rarely preserves dignity. The world wanted confession. He chose composure. And in doing so, he ensured that his story would never belong entirely to anyone else. But legends are not sustained by silence alone. They are sustained by those who carry them forward. For Lisa Marie Presley, the inheritance was never just musical, it was philosophical. She understood that the most powerful response to relentless curiosity is not always revelation. Sometimes it is boundary. She had lived long enough inside the myth to recognize its sharp edges. She knew how easily admiration could become intrusion, how quickly empathy could morph into entitlement. And so, when microphones were placed before her, she chose her words with precision, not to obscure truth, but to protect its shape. In the final years of her life, interviews often circled back to him, always him. The myth refused to loosen its grip, yet she did not appear resentful. If anything, there was a quiet steadiness in her answers. She acknowledged his humanity without dismantling his mystique. She spoke of love more than scandal, of memory more than rumor. That choice was not accidental. It was alignment. Because the greatest misunderstanding about Elvis was not that he was flawed. It was that he owed the world a detailed accounting of those flaws. He did not. Greatness does not cancel privacy. Fame does not erase the right to silence. And perhaps that is the truth audiences struggle with most. We believe access is entitlement. We believe admiration earns intimacy. But admiration is not ownership, and intimacy cannot be mass-produced.
The final realization is almost paradoxical. The myth survived because he never fully dismantled it. Had he narrated every weakness publicly, the image may have narrowed into something smaller, more ordinary. Instead, the ambiguity allowed multiple generations to project meaning onto him. To some, he remains rebellion. To others, romance. To others still, cautionary tale. The silence created space, and space allows legacy to breathe. Yet none of that diminishes the cost. Silence protected the legend, but it also isolated the man. It preserved dignity, but it limited connection. That tension is what makes the story linger, not because it is unresolved, but because it resists simplification. The world prefers clear endings, redemption arcs, downfalls explained, morals delivered neatly. This story refuses that comfort, because life refused it first. In the quiet hours before dawn, long after the applause of his final years had faded into memory, there were no cameras, no headlines, no analysts. Just a man who had given the world everything it asked for, except one thing, full access. And that refusal was not weakness, it was sovereignty. He controlled the one thing fame tries hardest to steal, narrative ownership. Lisa understood that deeply. She lived the aftermath of a legend that refused to over-explain itself. She saw how mystery can be both burden and shield. She carried the questions without surrendering to them, and in doing so, she proved something the world had overlooked for decades. The truth behind the Elvis myth was never hidden. It was simply incomplete by design. Not every chapter was meant for public consumption. Not every emotion required translation. Some parts of a life remain sacred precisely because they are unspoken. As the years pass and cultural tides shift, new artists rise, new icons dominate headlines, but Elvis remains. Not because every detail was clarified, but because not every detail was exposed.
The unanswered questions became part of the architecture. The restraint became part of the legend. And perhaps that is the final twist in a story defined by spectacle. The most powerful thing the king ever did was refuse to explain himself. No dramatic confession, no final tell-all, just music, presence, impact, and silence. Silence that once frustrated critics. Silence that protected a daughter. Silence that preserved complexity in a world desperate for simplicity. In the end, the myth was never about perfection. It was about magnitude. And magnitude does not require complete disclosure. It requires resonance. His life resonated. His choices resonated. Even his quiet did. So when visitors stand outside those gates, hoping to feel closer to the man behind the legend, they are not standing before unanswered questions. They are standing before a boundary he chose, a boundary that says, you may witness the performance, but the soul remains sovereign. And maybe that is the truest legacy of all. the king kept his crown, not just on stage, but in silence.